I was already picking up speed on the highway when I heard the first thud coming from inside the trailer. It wasn't the typical sound of cargo settling after a turn. It was something heavier, more direct, as if it had hit the inside side with enough force to make the steering wheel vibrate in my hands. I looked in the rearview mirror expecting to see a loose door or a rattling seal, but the seal was intact, shining under my own headlights. I slowed down a little to listen better, and then came another thud, this time more spaced out as if it had a rhythm. The weight of the trailer shifted slightly to the right and then back again, something palletized cargo doesn't usually do on its own. I remained silent for a few seconds inside the cab, trying to understand if I was exaggerating, until I realized that it didn't seem like an accident. I had left the distribution center in Joliet close to midnight, a dry load of electronics, all palletized and sealed according to company standards. It wasn't fragile cargo. It didn't require temperature control, just on-time delivery and no tampering. The night shift there is usually quick and direct. Little conversation, a lot of urgency to free up the dock. I did my visual check as always, checked the seal number, took photos, registered it in the system, and went up to the cabin. The wind was constant, not strong, just that dry Illinois cold that seeps in through the cracks in the door. As I exited through the east gate, I felt that the movement in the yard was a little more disorganized than usual. There were 3 trucks waiting at the dock in the same line, all with their headlights on and drivers inside, which is strange because normally they get out to supervise the loading. A forklift operator passed behind my trailer before they closed the door, but it didn't seem to be the same one assigned to my load. I didn't actually see anything irregular, just the feeling that someone was doing everything too fast. The supervisor signed off on the tablet without reviewing what was on the screen for very long. When they closed the door, I heard a short internal impact, but the operator said it was a pallet bumping against the side. The answer came before I even asked anything. The seal was placed in front of me, and I tested its tightness myself before leaving the dock. Correct number, firm locking mechanism, nothing loose. I took a photo as required by protocol and sent it to headquarters before even starting the engine. One of the employees stood watching while I engaged the trailer, and when I made eye contact, he simply turned his face away. It wasn't illegal behavior, just outside the norm for the place. I passed through the internal security checkpoint, and the guard checked the seal number more than once. He even flashed his flashlight at the rear door before letting me go, something he doesn't usually do with me. I set off onto the highway with the trailer responding normally, weight distributed as expected. The rear axle showed no signs of overload, and the truck was stable for the first few miles. There was a dark sedan keeping a steady distance behind me, too far to be a concern, too close to be a comfortable coincidence. After a few miles, it took another exit without signaling early. I stuck to the planned route, radio off, cabin silent. The clock showed just after midnight when the first thumps began. Up to that point, nothing was officially wrong. The third jolt was harder than the others, shifting the weight backward as if something had slid against the trailer door. I took my foot off the accelerator and spent a few seconds just feeling the axle's response, trying to distinguish the load movement from anything else. It wasn't a curve. It wasn't a pothole. The road was clear and straight in that stretch. I thought about pulling over to the side of the road and opening it right there, but the stretch was too dark and without streetlights for miles. It wasn't the kind of place where you open a trailer in the middle of the night alone. I needed to decide quickly whether to stop or continue to a safer spot. I picked up the phone from the cabin and called the dispatch center, but the call dropped before it connected. The signal there usually fluctuates, nothing out of the ordinary, but it wasn't the best time for it to fail. I tried again, and this time it rang, but no one answered on the night shift. The system showed that the cargo had been registered and released correctly, with no security alert. While I waited for someone to call back, I heard something different coming from the cargo compartment. Not a bang, but a slower, more controlled dragging sound, too controlled to be a loose box. It was as if the weight was being moved carefully. I looked at the number on the license plate I had photographed on my cell phone and mentally compared it to what I saw in the rearview mirror. It still seemed intact, with no sign of tampering. The first decision was simple in theory, but weighty in practice. I wasn't going to open that trailer alone in the dark. I decided to continue to the next gas station 20 miles ahead, where there was lighting and activity even at that hour. I maintained a constant speed, but my ear was more attentive than the engine. Every small internal movement seemed calculated. About 10 miles from the gas station, the movement inside stopped completely. Absolute silence, as if the trailer had suddenly become empty. This bothered me more than the previous knocks. Normal cargo still makes small noises, even when stabilized. That total absence of sound seemed intentional. I turned up the radio volume for a few seconds just to test if I was imagining things. When I turned it down again, I heard a single knock, too close to the tailgate. The object that ended up controlling everything was the metal seal itself. While I was driving, I kept watching it in the mirror as if I could detect any slightest change. There was no crack, no visible twist, nothing loose. Even so, when I slowed down to enter the gas station exit, I had a clear feeling that something had touched the door from the inside, exactly at the height of the seal. It was at that moment that I realized that my decision to continue to a well-lit place might have already been noticed by whoever was behind me. I pulled into the gas station, slowing down slowly, passing under the bright white light that usually reveals anything wrong with the truck. I pulled over away from the pumps, near the side of the building, where there were 2 cameras pointed at the yard. There was little traffic, just another truck parked on the other side and an old pickup truck parked near the store. I turned off the engine and stayed in the cab for a few seconds, waiting for some sound coming from the trailer. Nothing. Complete silence, as if it had never happened. I carefully climbed down, walking to the back without making unnecessary noise. The seal was exactly as I had left it, aligned, firm, without any cut or twist marks. I ran my hand along the metal door, trying to feel any internal vibration, but there was no movement at all. The streetlight illuminated only half of the trailer, leaving the other part in darker shadows than it should have been. I stood there a few seconds longer than usual, listening for something that wasn't coming. That's when I heard a muffled, short sound coming from inside, but different from the previous bangs. It sounded like someone shifting position against the metal, too light to displace weight, too loud to be thermal noise. I took 2 steps back without realizing I was doing it. I looked around and noticed that the pickup truck that had been near the store was now closer to my truck than before. I hadn't seen it move. I went back to the cabin and picked up the phone to call the carrier's security number directly. This time it connected, but the call took a while to get through. While I waited, I heard 3 quick knocks, one after the other, right at the level of the seal. It was as if someone knew where I was looking. By the time security answered, I was already explaining that I needed guidance regarding a possible internal breach, without external tampering. The response I received was unhelpful. They said that if the seal was intact, the instruction was not to open it without the presence of a local authority or authorized supervisor. While I still had the phone to my ear, the rear door vibrated once from the inside, strongly enough to make the metal tremble under the streetlight. And for the first time, I was certain that it wasn't cargo settling. While I was still talking to company security, the rear door suffered an impact strong enough to make the metal vibrate under the streetlight. It wasn't an uncontrolled blow. It was directed pressure, as if something was testing exactly where it would give way first. The entire truck swayed slightly, and I took 2 steps back without realizing I was moving backward. The pickup truck that was in the yard now had its engine running, but no headlights, and no one seemed to be getting out. I called the local police and explained that there was movement inside a sealed trailer, and the operator asked me not to approach the door until the patrol car arrived. Before I hung up, I heard something being dragged inside, too slowly to be loose cargo. When the police car's lights finally entered the gas station, the movement inside stopped instantly, absolute silence, as if someone had been warned. The officers cautiously got out, looked at the intact seal and then at me, waiting for an explanation I couldn't yet provide. One of the officers asked me to keep my distance while they positioned themselves behind the door with their weapons drawn. At that moment, I realized the consequence was already happening, regardless of what was found inside. I hadn't opened the trailer, but something back there had already decided to leave before any authorization, and the seal remained too intact for that situation. They cut the seal in front of me and opened the door with their guns drawn, expecting immediate resistance. At first, there was nothing but the palletized cargo exactly as it appeared in the documentation. aligned and seemingly intact. One of the officers went up first, shining a flashlight between the pallets, while the other provided cover outside. That's when they found the open space between two rows that didn't appear on the manifest, an improvised corridor in the middle of the cargo. There were clear marks of movement on the metal floor and signs that someone had been there long enough to rearrange boxes. There was no one inside when they finished the inspection, but there was enough evidence to turn it into a formal report. The report noted a possible breach before the final sealing, and the company was notified that same morning. I was escorted to the distribution center for a complete reinspection of the cargo under camera and state supervision. Some of the pallets had to be recounted, and 2 had broken internal seals, although officially nothing was missing. The police checked footage from the station and confirmed that the pickup truck left the location minutes before the patrol car arrived. My name remained linked to the incident until the conclusion of the internal investigation, even without proof of direct involvement. I continued driving after that, but I never again left a night distribution center without suspecting what might have gotten in before the seal closed. The internal investigation took several weeks, reviewing yard cameras, dock schedules, forklift movements, and shift employee logs. They discovered a short interval between the trailer's positioning and the official start of loading, enough time for someone to enter before the final sealing. No images clearly showed who it was, only shadows crossing areas outside the main camera angle. The company reinforced protocols, changed supervisors, and installed extra lighting at that specific dock. Officially, the case was treated as an attempted misuse of transport for unidentified illegal movement. My truck returned to its normal route after that. But what remained wasn't the report. It was the feeling that I drove miles carrying something that wasn't in the documentation. The intact seal fooled any superficial inspection, and for a few hours I was part of an operation I didn't even know existed. They never found the person inside, nor did they confirm where they went before the police car arrived. The pickup truck was never formally identified in the process. I continued driving, doing checks as I always have, but when I hear any unusual sound inside the trailer, I don't slow down just to hear better. I think about how long someone can stay hidden before deciding to come out. It's frightening to think that, even with the seal intact, you might be carrying something that shouldn't be there. This feeling of insecurity is what many of us face in isolated yards in the middle of the night. If this story from Illinois brought back any memories or gave you that chill down your spine, leave your like now. This gesture seems simple, but it's what tells the YouTube algorithm that this content is relevant, causing it to recommend our stories to more drivers and road enthusiasts. And so that I know how far beyond the quiet it's arriving today. Leave a comment saying which city or state you're listening to this video from and what time it is there now. I want to know who's on the highway or resting, following these reports with us. My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 42 years old and have spent over 15 years driving through the Southwest with dry cargo on routes that are far too long for surprises. I'm sending this account because I still haven't been able to explain what happened that morning on I-40, and perhaps someone who knows that stretch of road will understand better than I can. I was crossing an empty stretch of Arizona when the voice came into my radio as if it were already in the cab with me. There was no static, no channel request. It simply started saying my complete trailer number correctly, as if it were reading it from my dashboard. I wasn't transmitting anything. The microphone was attached to its mount, and my hands were on the steering wheel. The voice then mentioned the exit I would have missed minutes before, but I hadn't passed any exit yet. I had left Flagstaff shortly after 10 at night with a sealed dry cargo for delivery in Albuquerque before dawn. Nothing sensitive, nothing of high declared value, just sealed pallets and normal interstate transport documentation. The stretch of I-40 in that region is usually empty after 11, especially during the week. The weather was stable, a light crosswind and clear skies, good visibility for miles. I maintained a constant speed and the radio was on low just to pick up on the movement of other drivers. There was practically no one talking on that frequency. The CB radio isn't sophisticated equipment and interference happens all the time in the desert. Sometimes you pick up fragments of distant conversation or atmospheric noise, especially near elevated areas. But that night the channel was too clear, continuous silence for several minutes. No trucks requesting road conditions, no alerts about mobile patrols, nothing. That in itself was unusual for that time of day. When the voice came in calling my trailer number, I was already aware that the channel was too quiet. I mentally reviewed my route to confirm I hadn't missed any exits. There were still a few miles to the next relevant intersection, and the GPS confirmed the correct route. Even so, the voice repeated that I had missed the correct point and needed to return at the next opportunity. The tone wasn't aggressive or friendly, it was direct, almost bureaucratic. It sounded like someone reading standardized instructions. I looked in the rearview mirror searching for a specific vehicle behind me, but there were only headlights too far away to identify a model. I tried to respond via radio to understand who was speaking, but when I pressed the button to transmit, the frequency went silent. No static, no voice feedback, just total silence while I held the PTT. I released the button and the voice returned immediately, saying that I didn't need to confirm anything. It no longer sounded like a conversation between drivers. I had never heard anyone block transmission like that on a regular open channel. I looked at the dashboard again, checked if the radio was working properly, and tested the volume and squelch. Everything responded normally, except when I tried to speak. While I was doing these tests, the voice mentioned the type of cargo I was carrying, not with technical details, but enough to indicate that it knew the final destination. I hadn't mentioned this on the radio at any point, and up to that moment, I was still alone on that highway. When the voice mentioned the final destination of the cargo, I felt that kind of chill that has no relation to the desert climate. I hadn't announced my route on the radio, I hadn't spoken to anyone that night, and yet someone knew where I was going. I considered the possibility that someone had overheard a previous conversation back in Flagstaff, but I hadn't even used the channel there. I looked again in the rearview mirror searching for the nearest truck, but the road remained practically empty. The only constant was that overly clear voice coming through my radio, as if it had priority over any other signal. I decided to test something simple before making any sudden movements. I turned off the onboard computer completely for a few seconds, just to see if the transmission would stop completely. Silence returned to the cabin. Steady engine, tires on the asphalt, nothing but the normal noise of the road. I turned the radio back on and, even before adjusting the volume, the voice returned saying that I shouldn't turn off equipment in isolated areas. That no longer seemed like a technical coincidence. It seemed like monitoring. My first reaction was to think about temporarily changing course, leaving earlier than planned and stopping at a busier gas station. But changing course in the middle of the desert also creates a strange pattern if someone is following. I maintained the course for a few more miles while mentally analyzing the options. The GPS showed a normal route. No alerts, no suggested detour. The voice remained silent for far too long, as if waiting for my decision. I picked up my cell phone to try and call another driver I knew who also drove that route, just to confirm if anyone else was hearing anything strange on the channel. The signal was weak, but enough to start the call. Before it went through, the voice came back on saying I didn't need to involve anyone else. I hadn't even said anything out loud. I pressed the phone button to cancel the call before it went through, not understanding how that could be a coincidence. The object that began to guide my decision was the radio itself. I started to realize that every time I touched it or tried to use any means of communication, the voice reacted. I then decided to do the opposite of my initial instinct. Instead of responding or questioning, I would reduce communication to the absolute minimum. I maintained a constant speed, hands on the steering wheel, radio on, but without any attempt at contact. And it was in this calculated silence that the voice said that I had been followed since before I left Flagstaff. After the voice said I was being followed from Flagstaff, I did the only thing that still seemed logical. I checked my mirrors again, and the distance of the headlights behind me. There was a dark SUV a few hundred meters behind, but it had maintained a constant distance since before the first transmission. It didn't accelerate, it didn't slow down, it just stayed there within visual range. The voice then commented that I didn't need to check the rearview mirror, because the vehicle behind me had nothing to do with it. I hadn't mentioned anything about looking back. It was at that moment that I began to realize that the problem wasn't just the radio. I reduced my speed by 5 miles per hour to test the SUV's reaction, and it maintained the same proportional distance, neither closing in nor falling behind. Before I could make another decision, the voice returned, saying that changing speed wouldn't alter the schedule. The word schedule kept repeating in my head for a few seconds. I wasn't transporting anything out of the ordinary. There were no urgent deliveries registered beyond the usual deadline. The GPS continued to show the correct route with no alerts or deviations. Yet someone spoke as if there were a plan involving my presence on that stretch of road. I tried transmitting again via radio, not to reply, but to check if another trucker could hear my frequency. I pressed the button and again total silence while I held the PTT. I released it and the voice came on immediately, lower this time, saying that insisting wouldn't help. The SUV behind me pulled off the highway at the next exit without signaling in advance. The road was completely empty, as if it had been cleared on purpose. And it was there, with no other vehicle in sight, that the voice confirmed that I was truly alone. After the SUV pulled off the highway and I was completely alone on that stretch of I-40, the voice changed tone for the first time. It didn't get louder or more aggressive, just more direct, telling me to gradually slow down and prepare to exit at the next area on the right. I know that stretch well enough to know there was no marked rest area there, and the GPS showed nothing but desert for miles. Even so, a few seconds later, faint lights appeared in the distance, off the main highway, where nothing should have been operating at that hour. The consequences began there, even before I decided whether to obey or ignore them. My phone abruptly lost signal at that exact point, without any gradual transition. I maintained the speed limit and continued on without altering my route, ignoring the instruction. The voice didn't repeat the order, only commented that insisting on the main route would change the schedule planned for that night. I wasn't transporting anything out of the ordinary to warrant a schedule beyond the standard delivery. When the makeshift lights faded into the rearview mirror, the radio simply went silent, as if it had been switched off remotely. I pressed the transmission button several times, adjusted the volume and connection. Everything responded, but there was no signal coming in or out. The real disruption wasn't the voice disappearing, but realizing that I had continued on the main highway, and yet the feeling of external control remained inside the cabin. I drove another 40 miles until I found an open gas station near the state line, and the first thing I did was pull over in bright light and test the radio again. It worked perfectly, picking up normal conversations from other truckers as if nothing had happened. I asked on the channel if anyone had heard unusual interference in that area, and no one responded with anything out of the ordinary. I called the company's headquarters and reported what had happened, but without a recording or concrete proof, it was only registered as a possible technical failure. The supervisor asked if I had changed my route or made an unplanned stop, and I said no. Even so, it was noted in the system as an atypical occurrence. In the following days, the truck underwent a complete electrical inspection to check for any kind of intrusion or external equipment connected to the communication system. They found nothing out of the ordinary, nor any interference registered in the radio's memory. The strangest thing was that the route log showed a temporary loss of signal exactly at the point where the lights appeared, although the GPS equipment was functional before and after. The company recommended avoiding that stretch of road at night for a few weeks until a safety review. I continued driving, but since that early morning I haven't left the radio on silent for very long in isolated areas. Because when the channel gets too clear, I remember that someone has already spoken to me without me having pressed the button. There was never any official record of interference on that frequency that night, at least nothing that was shared with me afterward. The company treated it as an isolated technical failure and only recommended a preventative equipment update. I didn't change my route that day. I didn't stop where they told me to, and officially nothing happened beyond an unproven report. Even so, when I mentally review every detail, the sequence doesn't fit as a simple signal coincidence. The voice knew my trailer number, knew the destination, and reacted every time I tried to use another means of communication. This doesn't appear in any maintenance report. I continue driving along I-40 when the load demands it, but I rarely leave the radio on an open channel for long periods in the desert. If someone calls my number now, I confirm the origin before answering anything. I never heard that specific voice again, but I also never saw lights off the map in that stretch. What bothers me most isn't having been called by the correct number. It's knowing that someone was waiting for me to leave the main route, and that for a few minutes it seemed they had control over my every attempt to communicate. And on that empty road, too much silence is not a sign of tranquility. I don't know exactly why I'm writing this, but after what happened at that independent truck stop in Georgia, I started paying too much attention to places that used to be just quick stops. I'm 39 years old and have been driving cargo trucks in the South for over 14 years. I've pulled into isolated truck stops in the middle of the night without a second thought. That night seemed ordinary when I parked next to the diner. Dim yellow light, 3 trucks and a few cars scattered around the yard. But as soon as I opened the cab door, I realized no one was really talking. Everyone was standing still. And when I pushed open the diner door, the silence was immediate, as if someone had turned off the sound system. I was coming from Jacksonville with a sealed dry cargo to unload in Birmingham early the next morning. It was past midnight when I decided to leave the interstate and fill up at that independent truck stop in rural Georgia. It wasn't a well-known chain. It was one of those places that combined an old pump, a small workshop, and a diner attached to the side. The neon sign was partially flashing, but the pumps were working. There was enough traffic to make it seem truly open, but not enough to seem busy. I parked near the diner and noticed 3 trucks lined up on the other side of the lot. None of them were refueling. They were all off, but with drivers inside, visible by the dim light on their dashboards. There were also some cars scattered around, positioned at almost equal distances from each other. None were near the main entrance of the diner. I didn't see anyone walking around the parking lot, nor any customers walking to the pumps. Even so, it seemed like everyone was waiting for something. I stepped out of the cabin and walked to the diner door, feeling like I was being watched, even though no one had made direct eye contact yet. When I pushed the door open, the ambient sound simply stopped. It wasn't gradual. Conversations ceased instantly. Cutlery seemed to hover in midair, and even the old ceiling fan appeared louder by contrast. There were at least 10 people inside, seated at different tables, but they all turned their heads in my direction at the same time. There was no whispering, no exaggerated reaction, just a fixed stare. The waitress stood behind the counter holding an order pad without writing anything down. She didn't ask what I wanted, just kept her eyes on me long enough to make me uncomfortable. A man near the window raised his glass to his lips without looking away. Another table, further back, seemed to be in the middle of a conversation before I arrived, but no one brought it up again. I took a few steps to the counter trying to act normal, but the silence didn't break. I only ordered a coffee to justify stopping by, and the response was too short, almost mechanical. While I waited, I noticed that nobody was really eating. The plates were in front of people, but the cutlery remained motionless. The television in the corner was on without volume, displaying a static image of a local channel. When the waitress placed the cup in front of me, everyone was still looking. Not at the counter, at me. I stood there with the cup in my hand for a few seconds, trying to act as if it were just my imagination. I took a sip of the coffee, which was too hot to have been brewed long ago, and waited for someone to resume the conversation or at least look away. No one looked away. The man near the window still had his cup raised, not drinking. The television remained on silently, showing the local weather forecast as if that were relevant to anyone inside. I needed to decide whether to finish my coffee or leave without making a fuss. The object that came to guide my decision was the cup itself. As I held it, I realized my hands were more tense than they should have been for something so simple. The waitress remained standing behind the counter, not taking an order, not asking anything. One of the customers at the nearest table tilted his head slightly to the side, a movement too small to be casual. It didn't seem like ordinary country curiosity. It seemed like confirmation of presence. I put the cup back on the counter without finishing. I said I needed to continue my journey and left enough money for coffee, even though it was almost untouched. The waitress didn't respond. She just picked up the bill and put it in the drawer without checking the amount. No customer followed my movement physically, only with their eyes. When I pushed open the diner door to leave, I had the impression that the silence became even denser for a second. I didn't hear chairs being dragged. I didn't hear any conversation resume. Only the sound of the door closing behind me. As soon as I stepped back into the parking lot, I noticed that all the vehicles were in exactly the same position as before. No doors open, no headlights on, no drivers outside. The trucks on the other side remained with occupied cabs, but too still for those about to rest. The air seemed even stiller than a few minutes earlier. And as I walked towards my truck, I felt that everyone inside the diner was still looking through the dark glass. Before climbing into the cab, I did a quick sweep of the yard as I usually do. That's when I noticed something that wasn't obvious when I arrived. The tires on 2 trucks were visibly too low, almost collapsed against the asphalt. A third appeared to be in the same state. No driver was checking it. None seemed concerned. My truck was the only one that looked ready to leave without hindrance. I climbed into the cab slowly, trying not to appear rushed, but I had already decided I wouldn't stay there any longer than necessary. I started the engine, and the sound broke the silence of the courtyard almost aggressively. At the same instant, the diner doors opened. Not abruptly, but too coordinated to seem like a coincidence. Some people began to get out and position themselves near their vehicles without speaking to each other. None of them had their cell phones in their hands. None of them seemed surprised by anything. As I adjusted my seatbelt and engaged the gear, I noticed that everyone who left the diner stopped walking at the same time. They were spread out across the parking lot as if they already knew where they should be. There was no visible signal, no commanding gesture, only synchronization. The man who had been near the window was now beside one of the cars with a flat tire, but he made no move to fix anything. He just watched. And he wasn't the only one. I slowly moved toward the main exit, and that's when I clearly saw that the tires of at least 3 vehicles were completely flat, touching the asphalt. It wasn't natural wear and tear, it was intentional deflation. None of them seemed concerned about it. My truck was the only one there in a condition to move immediately. When I lined up with the exit, I noticed that everyone else scattered around the yard had turned in the same direction. They didn't say anything. They just followed my movement with their eyes. When I aligned the truck with the exit, I noticed that the pump closest to the road had been slightly displaced off its normal axis, as if someone had recently bumped into it. It didn't completely block the passage, but it reduced enough space to force a slower maneuver. I hadn't noticed this on arrival. I engaged first gear without accelerating hard, but already calculating the exact angle so as not to get stuck there. The moment I started to turn the steering wheel, the people scattered around the yard took 2 steps forward at the same time. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They just moved forward. The man who was next to the car with the flat tire stood exactly in line with my left headlight, but didn't cross. He just stood there, as if measuring distance. The waitress stepped out of the diner door and remained motionless, looking directly at the booth. Neither of them made any gesture to stop me from leaving. None of them seemed nervous. It didn't seem like an attempted robbery. It seemed like a test. When I accelerated a little more to gain space, they didn't back away. They just held their position. I completely ignored any makeshift signs near the exit and accelerated just enough to leave the yard without slowing down. The instant my truck's tires touched the highway asphalt again, everyone there turned in the same direction, following my departure with their whole bodies. There was no chase, no honking, no attempt at a final blockade. Just that silent, collective movement as I left the place behind. I drove for at least 20 miles before slowing down to catch my breath. The road was empty and the dashboard didn't indicate anything out of the ordinary, but my mind was still on the parking lot of that gas station. I called the company's headquarters and simply reported that I had left an independent truck stop due to strange behavior from the patrons. I didn't use exaggerated words, just described synchronization issues and flat tires. The supervisor asked if there had been any attempted robbery or damage to the truck. I said no. Officially, there was nothing concrete. The following morning, before unloading, I asked a colleague to quickly check if he recognized that specific gas station. He said he had passed by during the day, and it seemed ordinary, but he had never stopped there in the early morning hours. Later, I checked online reviews and found vague comments mentioning a strange atmosphere and people who are overly observant, but nothing that would constitute a police report. No formal record of illegal activity appeared in a quick search. This almost bothered me more than if something had actually come up. A few days later, the company sent a notice recommending preference for larger networks on night routes in that region, without mentioning my name directly. They said they had received more than one informal report about unusual behavior at that specific location. None detailed a direct crime. None mentioned assault. Just a strange pattern of group gatherings. My truck was undamaged. My cargo arrived intact. But since then, I avoid any isolated gas station where engines are left running and nobody seems to be genuinely passing through. I never went back to that truck stop, and I never saw an official report pointing out any irregularities there. It might have just been a coincidence of people waiting for something unrelated to me. It might have been late-night paranoia after driving many miles. But to this day, I can't reconcile the fact that everyone stopped talking at the same time, left at the same time, and positioned themselves in the parking lot as if they already knew where to go. Completely flat tires don't just appear by chance on 3 different vehicles, and nobody there seemed concerned about resolving the issue. I continue driving through the South as I always have, stopping and leaving smaller gas stations as needed. But when I park now, I observe patterns before turning off the engine. If the vehicles are too closely aligned, if the engines are left running for no reason, I don't get out of the cab. That night there was no declared crime, no direct approach, no explicit threat. There was just too much coordination to be considered casual. And sometimes that's enough. The road is never as empty as it seems. If you enjoy following these true stories, don't forget to subscribe. Subscribe and leave your like. Leave a comment. Tell us what you thought of today's stories. This simple gesture greatly helps the channel gain relevance and be recommended to more people. Do you have a story of your own that you'd like to see told here? Leave it in the comments as well. Thank you for your company, and drive carefully.